So welcome for everyone viewing at home on YouTube or other platforms where we stream. This is Matthew Ehret. With me is Cynthia Chung with Rising Tide Foundation, and we are very happy to have some special guests with us today, Elizabeth Gould and Paul Fitzgerald, who are incredibly prolific authors who have been around for a long time. And I was just so happy. I'd encountered their names again now and again while writing various reports on history and geopolitics. And it was only with this wonderful surprise this summer where we received a manuscript of a pre-published book called Valediction, Nights of Desmond, co-written by Paul and Elizabeth. And, you know, Afghanistan has come much more into the psyche in the last several months with everything that's been going on. And so it's been something which I felt has been taught to death, that nothing really new could be said about the subject of Afghanistan. So when I began reading the book, and I know Cynthia felt something very similar, we were blown away by the angles that were provided by both of you guys in the course of this narrative, which was done in such an interesting way. And unlike a lot of the commentators, what makes this book special isn't just that you're bringing in so many different moving parts of world history, as well as deep politics, things that usually are ignored by mainstream media, but you're also speaking as people who were on the ground, on the cutting edge of a period in history that fundamentally altered all of world history as we know it. So for that, again, thank you for taking the time. And I know Cynthia has a question to open up this discussion.
Right. So you were the only American journalist that were allowed into Afghanistan post December 1979. And in your book, I mean, we have a lot of time to unpack it in this interview, but through your multiple visits to Afghanistan, you found that there was an increasing contradiction between what you were observing and what mainstream media was reporting. You made the point that the American position on Afghanistan was a contradiction, as you say in your book, quote, of historic proportions, which on the one hand claimed the Soviets had invaded Afghanistan to launch a conquest of the Middle East, while at the same time undermining their efforts to withdraw, preferring instead to keep them bogged down in a Vietnam-style quagmire. End quote. So I would like it if you could maybe introduce yourselves a little bit in terms of how you found yourself, you know, coming into this. What was your comprehension of U.S. foreign policy before, and how it changed, and what was the motivation to focus on understanding Afghanistan, and how this changed your overall comprehension of Cold War geopolitics that was being played from both sides?
Well, actually, you know, this has to go back actually to the late 1960s. You know, Paul and I actually didn't know each other in the late 1960s, but we were both involved in, you know, as college students, and what was really big at the time was the anti-Vietnam War movement. And in our own way, we were both involved in that. And we actually came together, ironically, in a very unusual way that really did kind of, I think, you know, alter and direct us in ways that we never could have imagined. Paul ended up in the American rock musical Hair in Boston, and he got the lead role. And I ended up knowing people because of my associations at Emerson College and people I was associated with, being connected to the people that were in Hair. And so we ended up meeting at that point. And Hair was this amazing focus of the anti-war movement that was so powerful and so total. And we had a whole year, because that was the length of the Boston run, was a year. So it was at a time when there was so much going on. And the sense that we got from it was that we were involved as, you know, college kids in something real, in something changing the world for our future that we believed in. And Hair seemed to embody all of that. We would have audiences every night. You know, one of the reasons I was aware of all that was because once we started, dating and stuff like that, I ended up at the show all the time. And I got to see a lot of the things that Paul was experiencing on stage. And there was an intensity and a power to that movement, which caused different generations would watch that show in one evening, and everybody was just mesmerized by the power of the voice that was coming through. It was so authentic and so clear. And so by the end of the run, we ended up, finally getting together and moving on. And eventually, when the Vietnam War ended in 1975, we were working together, we were moving along. And, actually it was because of Jimmy Carter running for president in 1976. And the whole movement at that point was about trying to change the trajectory that had come off of the Vietnam War into a non-military approach. The Vietnam War had so decimated the belief in the technology was going to save us. McNamara and his numbers game didn't work. It drove everyone crazy. And so we were aware of all of that. We were moving with people in that world. And at one point, Paul ended up getting a talk show. And part of that gave us the opportunity to do a documentary about the SALT Treaty, which was the basis on which Jimmy Carter was being elected. It was about détente. It was about talking with the Soviets, moving in a direction. It was about treaties, moving away from the military, the isolated military approach. And there were so many people in Washington that were so desperately trying to move in that direction. It was like really exciting. And so Jimmy Carter gets elected. Our documentary is eventually developed. It would have been towards this would have been towards the end of the 1979. And suddenly, the Soviets crossed the border into Afghanistan. And it was as if overnight, the entire concept of détente, of peace and negotiation, of reinvesting in the American economy, and I think that was the most important part, by the way. In the United States at that point, the economy was so fragile, the inflation was raging so crazily that there was an awareness that we had to reinvest in the Main Street economy. The military economy had gotten too much because of the Vietnam War. So it was really amazing to witness this sudden shift that went from awareness to suddenly it was over. And we got the word from a lot of people we were working with that the Soviets just blew it. It's over. And we didn't know what had happened. And the more we looked at what had happened, we began to question how could this story have come out so quickly? President Carter called it the greatest threat to peace since the Second World War. And it was literally the day after the invasion. Everything seemed to already have been planned. So we got that sense about it. And we just kept trailing it. Well, about a month after the Soviet invasion, all the Western media was kicked out. And that's when we began to consider the possibility of trying to get in. And it actually took us quite a long time. We didn't get in there. It took us until 1981. We didn't get in there until the spring of 1981. But the idea that there was a story there that was being hidden, and we knew there was something going on, and we knew that it had a lot to do with the fact that the entire progressive movement, the entire concept of peace and negotiation seemed to collapse into nothing. And it made us wonder, where is the reality in all of this? So that was the beginning.
And
we began.
yeah. And it was quite a journey that you go through in the book. At what point did you make the connection with focusing on the American ambassador to Afghanistan, Adolph Dubs, and how that had fit into part of, as you said yourself, that the more you looked into things, it looked like everything had been kind of pre-orchestrated, pre-planned?
Well, it was very suspicious from the very beginning. I mean, everything just started to happen in lockstep. I mean, we wrote a book 10 years ago called Invisible History, Afghanistan's Untold Story. And I wanted to call it a clockwork Afghanistan, out of the idea with kind of like, Malcolm McDowell's Clockwork Orange, Anthony Burgess's Clockwork Orange, I should say, whereby everything just looked normal, everything seemed normal, but all of a sudden everything just started to be this mechanical machine just kind of took over and things just started to happen. So I started looking back at some of the things that had led up to that. I'd heard about this thing called the Team B. Team B was a right-wing group of right-wing intellectuals that had started out with Albert Wohlstetter. And back in 1972 or 73, in which he wrote a letter protesting what the CIA was doing vis-a-vis the Soviet Union in terms of the way it was analyzing exactly what they were up to. And the CIA really just didn't pay much attention to it. And then, so the right wing, led by a guy by the name of Paul Nitze, who a very powerful figure, married to an Exxon heiress, very powerful guy. He always talked about himself. He said he was the last stockbroker who was hired on Wall Street before the crash in 1929. And he was a mover and shaker, very ambitious. And so he had put together back in the 1950s, a group called the Committee on the Present Danger. And what they did was they basically opposed anything about having a mutual anything with the Soviet Union. They essentially wanted to eliminate the Soviet Union, eliminate the competition. So here he was back again. So they were very involved with getting the United States into Vietnam, and a very aggressive anti-communist effort in the 1950s and 1960s, which of course had just resulted in disaster. So these people were completely without any credibility whatsoever. They had just shown over 20 years that their ideas were nonsense. And but the system in Washington was looking for answers. They were desperate for answers. What did they do? The system collapsed. McNamara's way of fighting the war had collapsed. He'd used what he did in World War II, the whole numerical equations on how to defeat an enemy, counterforce structure, all kinds of things that had been thought up at Rand and MIT and Caltech and Stanford and all these different high-tech places, and it had failed. So when your best and your brightest can't do it, what do? So what do? They called in the fringe. They called in the people who hated the Russians. They called in the ethnic brigade. In fact, I got a book here. It was called the Benigsen theory. I think it was this is one of the books that was put out. This is put out in the 80s. And there's another one here, and it's all about turning the Islamic population in the Soviet-controlled states against Moscow. And that was the whole idea behind it. Now, these people had been out there since the 1950s. I think Benigsen had worked for British intelligence, cooking up his theories. And everybody said in Washington, "Oh, this is ridiculous. This is medieval. What you're talking about, bringing these right-wing conservative groups that live in the Middle Ages to fight the Soviet Union, this industrialized power. There's no way you can possibly do anything with this." But they were so desperate, the institution was so desperate at the end of the Vietnam War that they said, "We got nothing to lose, let's try it." And so that's where Brzezinski, when Carter got elected, he brought in Zbigniew Brzezinski. Now, Zbigniew Brzezinski was a known Russophobe. He had a long history of this. And he worked with a guy named Paul Hens. And as soon as he gets in there, in January 1977, they create this thing called the Nationalities Working Group, the objective of which is to turn the struggle against the Soviet Union into an ethnic struggle. And so they're working from the very beginning. In fact, Robert Gates talks about his book, in his book, From the Shadows, how that Brzezinski wanted an aggressive approach. And he said the CIA, because of Watergate and because of the Church Committee hearings that had gone on exposing all the dirty things that they'd been doing in the 50s and 60s, didn't want to put their hands on it. They said, you want to send brigades into the Soviet Union, into Soviet space, and start riling them up to protest against armed insurrection, blowing up power stations and power lines and burning schools. We can't do that. We get caught doing that, we're done. So anyway, so they said, well, don't worry about it. We'll take care of it. We have a way of dealing with it. So that's when the Saudis really stepped in, was during that time period, 1975, 76, 77, 78, a thing called the Safari Club. And so what they started doing is that they started working, they had this bank called the BCCI, the Bank of Credit, Commerce and Credit International, otherwise known as the Bank of Crooks and Criminals, Incorporated. Everybody used this bank. I mean, all the intelligence agencies, this was just manna from heaven. They were trading in drugs, they were trading in weapons, they were doing all kinds of things. CIA didn't have to get involved. They could credible deniability, they could claim. They weren't involved in it directly. The Saudis were more than willing to do it. The Pakistanis were more than willing to help. And so they said, and simultaneously, of course, what was happening was you had, at the fall of Vietnam, the entire narco industry that was fueling a lot of these intelligence operations for the French and the British and the United States, it collapsed in Southeast Asia. So that entire enterprise had to move somewhere. And the people who were living on the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan were more than happy to supply the necessary opportunities for that drug trade to move in there. Okay, and that's why we wind up today with Afghanistan and that border region, Northwest Frontier Province in Pakistan, as being the greatest, most incredible opium and heroin producing region on the face of the earth. Okay, and it all became as a result of the Carter administration and Zbigniew Brzezinski and his ethnic foreign policy at Everett's during that time period. So that's how that got started. Now, there were triggers to that, of course, and I know that you're interested in this thing about Adolph Dubs, the American ambassador. He's critical because he's a flashpoint. Now, we've seen all these things happen where the institution comes up with an excuse and they say, oh, we have such an emergency now, we have to put all the laws and all the rules and all the diplomacy aside and rush in and fix this problem because otherwise we're doomed if we don't do it. It happened, of course, in 9/11. It happened when Adolph Dubs was killed in February of 1979. Now, this is where it gets interesting because if you actually look at what Adolph Dubs was trying to do, representing the more moderate aspect of the American political scene going into 1970, 77, 78, and 79, Adolph Dubs was a moderating force. He knew the Soviets. He'd been in Moscow at the US Embassy during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He had been there, he knew them, he was nuanced. And he said, look, what we want to do, he told Cyrus Vance, the Secretary of State, before he left for Kabul in 1978, in the spring of 1978, we want to do enough to be able to win the Afghans to our side, but not too much so that they'll feel that they have to invade. That's the trick, maintaining a balance. Now, the opposing number was Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the National Security Council, National Security Advisor, the National Security Council, and he wanted the opposite. He was looking for the opportunity to trap the Soviets someplace in their own Vietnam. He had the institutional support of the Pentagon, the CIA, the DIA, all of these various agencies within the US government, because they all wanted revenge against the Russians for their support of the North Vietnamese in this humiliating defeat. So the rational became irrational. Paul Warnke, the guy who negotiated the SALT II agreement, told us in an interview, he said that he was asked by Lyndon Johnson to go with Robert McNamara to Moscow in 1968. Now, that was the year that Nixon got elected, first time, 1968. And he said they went to the Soviet Union and they talked to the Soviets, and the Soviets said, look, we know the system is ending. We know we have a limited time period to go, but how do we get out of it? We've got this gerontocracy that's running the country that still thinks it's 1929, 1930. We've got to be able to, we've got to update, we've got to renew it, and we don't know how to do that. Can you help us? That was the beginning of detente. And so that happened in the Johnson administration. It didn't happen later. It happened in the Johnson administration. So by 1972, 73, the neocons, the neoconservatives were beginning to come on strong in the American political system, and they didn't want any relationship with the Soviet Union at all. There was a lot of stuff that was going on and it was basically the hinge there. The lever was Israel. Israel didn't want anybody who could interfere with their relationship with the United States and with international affairs in the Middle East. Israel wanted to be able to call its own shots. They wanted to be able to go to Washington and they'd say, this is what we need when we have to deal with the Egyptians, when we have to deal with the Saudis, when we have to deal with all these different people. And so as a result of that, they didn't want the Soviet Union and the United States solving problems in the Middle East. And that was the motivation initially behind the neoconservatives. And eventually once they got the power, once they got things going and cooking and working with the Saudis, actually, they wound up, and the Safari Club, by the way, was very instrumental in negotiating the deal between Israel and Egypt. They actually made it possible for Jimmy Carter to look like a great hero when the peace accords that were signed, okay? And that was all arranged by the Safari Club. That was all under the table. These things were not above board. They were all done behind the scenes. So we've been looking at least since the Carter administration, and I'm sure before, of course, but the period of time we're dealing with, we're looking at basically a stage play. And now we've got to the point where the theater's falling down, the drapes don't work anymore, the curtains get drawn and the curtains fall down on the cast. Nobody even knows what the play is any longer. They ran out of code, I think, a long time ago. And they're trying to blame this crowd. One crowd wants to blame the Russians, another crowd wants to blame the Chinese, another crowd wants to blame it on this, another crowd wants to blame it on that. So this is where we are right now, and it's called chaos, I think. So
yeah, no, I think you really are. We're witnessing a system just imploding under its own self-contradictions,
Exactly.
and hubris. I think there's a healthy dose of unhealthy dose of hubris animating this beast.
We actually have a word for it. We call it's late stage imperial dementia.
That's good. That's really good. No matter how much opium you give it, it's not going to come back to help.
No, it exceeds opium.
I mean,
it exceeds
this latest revelation that President Biden is working on a stage set at the office building, the executive office building. He's not giving his press conferences out of the Oval Office.
Yeah,
he's not. They have a stage built, and they're showing the people. I mean, it just gives you the impression that they're admitting the fact that this is all for show.
It's a caricature. Yeah. It's a caricature of itself.
It's
Absolutely.
Really I never thought I'd see it in my lifetime. But here we are.
I think it's good that you guys have such a sense of humor, because I think that helps you navigate through a lot of people. They try to impose, I think, foolishly logic, too much logic onto the system when they're analyzing history.
Yes,
and you can't do that because the system itself doesn't operate on logic per se. You have to be sensitive to this type of folly and self-contradictory behavior, which is why I think empires always eat themselves up like Rumpelstiltskin. Once you guess their name.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the reasons why we wrote our story, our memoir, the way we wrote it. It was because, I sat down, I had a 700-page manuscript that read like, a loaf of bread and a couple of bricks, and it's like all these incidents that we experienced, which were personal, they were all real, they all happened. But they, when you put them together over a period of time, and a lot of this stuff was intellectual, it was Liz and I talking, how do we figure this out? People say, how did you get into Afghanistan and how'd you do that? Well, we sat and we talked about it at breakfast, and we drank a lot of coffee, and we worked on it, and we talked to some people here and talked to some people there, and finally said, this is what we need to do. And that's how it came about. But how do you present that in a way that's going to, get an audience to listen to you? Well, it's kind of like listening to Paul and Liz, talking about the world over breakfast, So
yeah, Yeah.
kind of-
And that's why it's such a
as a
pleasure.
married couple, you can appreciate that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And we're used to reading a lot of obviously nonfiction data crunching just as part of the journalistic enterprise,
exactly.
and so it's really it was a pleasure to be able to read that more novel type of narrative that you guys are
Right.
presenting, where you're taking people through this journey in a very interesting way. And to jump back to the book itself, you've touched on so many things that I want to do a follow-up question on, and I have to pick which one I want to tackle. But I think the issue of Team B, I want to just ask you a follow-up question on that, because you are pressing up against the idea that there's not just one American empire homogenous thing, the way many people naively think, but you began realizing that there was this fight within US intelligence between opposing worldviews. And you've brushed on that in what you've just said about Ambassador Dubs, who I didn't even know about, frankly, until I read your book, representing the more sane faction, which had a much more competent view of the way the world should and could work, versus this other fringe psycho group that became the mainstream with the neocons. Could you say a little bit more about how it was that, I know in your book you mentioned that there were like debates set up between the Zbigniew Brzezinski, Paul Nitze Team B faction versus the analysis that was being formally considered the norm by the conventional patriotic, or I won't say patriotic, but more rational branch of American intelligence. You said that it was sort of not sabotaged, but one side was sort of set up to lose that debate when Team B's assessment of what Russia's ambitions were supposed to win this debate. Could you say something about how that was set up?
Well, Team B was as I said to begin with, the origin was already there in America's right wing, and it wasn't just America's right wing. I mean, we're talking old fascist organizations. We're talking a lot of ex-Nazis. We're talking groups like the World Anti-Communist League, guys like James Burnham, as an example, was very pivotal in the formation of the neoconservative ideal, because he was influenced, he was educated in Britain, came to the United States. He wasn't American, but he came to the United States, back to the United States, 1929, got a job with Sidney Hook, and the two of them basically were Trotskyists. And he went for years, he became writing all these things for Trotsky, corresponding with Trotsky, became Trotsky's secretary, and got to explore what was then referred to as Marxist-Leninism and the difference between the Stalinists and the Trotskyists.
Well, I think it was also important to remember that Burnham came out of the 1929 crash, where many people like Burnham believed that was the end of capitalism. So they were very open to something else, and he embraced this thing called Trotskyism, Marxism.
Very
whatever.
similar to what happened in
Yeah,
1975.
but when it became obvious that they actually hadn't really just ended, they actually were resurrecting themselves. They were coming back. You can see by 1940, Burnham switched sides, and that's all part of, I think, the reason that Burnham was never really on the other side, so to speak, I think.
Right. So what happened is that the institution, as represented by Cyrus Vance and the standard Eastern establishment people that got the US into Vietnam, they broke the system. The system just proved that it couldn't solve the problem. And the problem was designated that it was international communism. And that was happening in South America with the National Liberation Fronts down there. And it was happening in Southeast Asia. It was happening all over in Europe. They were controlling it. They controlled it because they had an army in Eastern Europe, and they had an army in Italy, and an army in Germany, and an army after World War II that was positioned to basically suppress any kind of serious communist threat that they considered a threat. And so at one point in the 60s, I think the Italians were about to elect a communist government, and the hysteria, broke out in Washington. But the fact is that, that was when 1975 happened, they realized they couldn't control it with the available things that they had. So they had to call on some unorthodox means. And so that's where the CIA basically said, well, we're doing the best we can with the Team B, with the analysis. And they said, well, you're not looking at the things that Richard Pipes, as an example from Harvard University, said, you're not looking at the Soviet intentions. And the CIA came back and said, how can we know what the Soviet intentions are? We're not mind readers. They said, well, maybe they are. Maybe they're mind readers. Maybe they're reading your mind. And we said, well, all the things you're accusing us of doing at the CIA, you can't prove. And he said, the fact that we can't prove it is proof they're doing it. So how do you fight that kind of argument? That's solipsism. I mean, the logic is like mind-boggling. And this is what it was acknowledged very early on by John, yes?
Burnham. James Burnham?
No, Fulbright, by James, by Fulbright.
Yeah.
Yeah, that this was a problem that was happening. And he said, you can't argue. He wrote a wonderful piece back in
Senator Fulbright wrote an article in 1972,
right,
which actually is amazing that he was able to articulate so clearly the incredible power that the neocon insanity had over the thinking about Vietnam.
Right.
And what was so amazing, though, was to see that when the Vietnam War ended in 1975, and of course, Team B happened right at that point and was instituted, I think, by through that would have been through Bush, when he was the head of the CIA. And, by Jimmy Carter's time, it had already been activated. Okay.
George Bush Sr. was the one who let the Team B in.
Right.
He was the guy who ushered it through,
Right.
so that they could actually do something unprecedented. They let all these right-wing ideologues in to analyze what the CIA was doing. And of course, what did they come to the conclusion of? The CIA is completely wrong and we're completely right.
Right, but the idea that they actually put forth, that actually we consider to be the most important idea, was that the Soviet Union was going to cross a border, and it was going to prove to the world that they intended to basically take over the world. All right, and it's amazing how Zbigniew Brzezinski gets into the White House in January of 1977 and begins to activate his Nationalities Working Group, which was dedicated to stirring up trouble on the Soviet Union's southern border in the Muslim republics, okay, in order to provoke exactly what they actually had prophesied in the Team B report. So you can begin to see that, I think the important thing to remember is that a lot of these mentalities that work in Washington, think of them as they're really on the same side, but they take differing opposing positions to appear as if they're not together, but they really are together.
We want to get
totally.
back to Dubs, because Dubs is critical to this whole process. So what happens is that Adolph Dubs goes there in 1978. He's assigned Theodore Eliot, the dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, winds up leaving in 1978 and is replaced by Adolph Spike Dubs. Spike is a very seasoned diplomat. He's very nuanced in terms of his approach, which is very unlike most of the diplomats that get appointed to places like Afghanistan. And Afghanistan, by the way, had been demoted from a third-rate posting to like a fourth-rate posting during this time period. It was considered not a problem at all. Afghanistan had been relegated to the Soviet sphere of influence in the 1950s. It was taken for granted that they needed Soviet support because they were right next door. The Soviets had come in and put billions of dollars into the country. They built the bread factory in Kabul. They built the roads. They put the roads everywhere. They built the Polytechnic school. They were educating people. And so the US basically threw in a couple of $100 million. The Soviets threw in billions of dollars. And the Afghans, they said, well, who's ever going to give us the money is the people we're going to go with. The Afghan government during the 1950s wanted desperately to have a relationship with the United States. And they said, look, you're right next to the Soviet Union. There's nothing we can do. We have Pakistan there in case anything happens. But in the meantime, we're busy in Southeast Asia. Well, 1975 happens. We're not busy in Southeast Asia anymore. So Adolph Dubs goes in there, and he was the Deputy Under Secretary of State for Near East and South Asia. And he had done a tour back in January of 1978 to determine what the narcotics committee in the House, okay, Select Committee on Narcotics. And they had done a tour of Southeast Asia, and then they did a tour of South Central Asia. And he picked up on this whole idea that the whole drug industry was moving at that time from Southeast Asia to South Central Asia. So he was very keen, knowing what to do with it and what the amount of potential was for the drugs to be grown in South Central Asia as opposed to Southeast Asia. There would have been no competition. It would have been under the control of the Pakistani government. And so as a result of that, he goes in there, he's trying to work a very difficult situation, moving this radical regime that took over in 1978. There had been a coup in which the king's cousin had been running the country since 1973, and had declared a republic in 1973. So 1978, a Marxist group called the People's Democratic PDPA, People's Democratic Society of Afghanistan, takes over, and they are basically broken between extremists on the one hand and more or less pro-Russians on the other hand, pro-Stalinist on the other hand. So he goes in and he says, it's going to be very difficult, but the guy who's really running the show is this guy named Hafizullah Amin, and he's a wild man. He's a, you might have even go so far as to say he was criminally inclined. He had been to the United States twice. He was educated at Columbia, came back a second time in the 1960s to get his PhD at Columbia, and was told he had to go back to Afghanistan. He goes back to Afghanistan in the 1960s, gets himself involved in leftist politics. And I say leftist, I mean leftist politics. The Communist Party in the Soviet Union did not consider the people in Afghanistan to be communists. They said there's just absolutely no way. And the Communist Party, the two people, Hafizullah Amin and Nur Muhammad Taraki, who were running the party, were disgusted with Moscow. They said, we'll go to India. We'll get the recognition of their Communist Party as communists, okay? But they, and you read now, you can read the Politburo analysis of Hafizullah Amin. You can read the Politburo analysis of what the party was going on. You've got Brezhnev at one point saying something to the effect of,
he's a CIA asset, that he's a CIA asset?
That he's a CIA. They always suspected he was a CIA asset. In fact, even Amin admitted that. I think Louis Dupree, the premier American anthropologist who was in Afghanistan, wrote a couple of books.
Who was a CIA?
Who was himself a CIA agent. He admitted that he had taken money from the CIA, but he claimed, well, they didn't influence me. But he actually had a Soviet advisor instructing him on what to do with his finances. And he wanted to know, Hafizullah Amin wanted to know whether he could take the $400 million that was in the Afghan bank and move it to an offshore account someplace in Switzerland or someplace, so he could have access to it. So this is the kind of guy he was. And they considered him a petty bourgeois. They didn't think he was serious at all. The Americans thought he was a ruthless criminal. And they stated it pretty clearly in some of their cables that they sent back to Washington about who they were dealing with. So
before you go any further, I wanted to maybe clarify for the audience, because I think we're all in a position where we've recently read the book and you guys wrote the book. So it's very fresh in all of our minds. But to maybe just clarify for the audience that Ambassador Dubs, he was assassinated on Valentine's Day, 1979. The Soviets invade in December 1979 and kill President Amin. Could you explain a little bit for the audience why the official narrative of who killed Ambassador Dubs is highly dubious, which was putting the blame on the Soviets, which was what was the stress, the little carrot dangling for a provocation to invade, and how this tied Amin into the situation, maybe also how Amin's relationship to Gould and Hekmatyar is, I think, more of a tell of where Amin was, in his loyalties, if anything, them also coming from the same tribe, right. and how this was orchestrated, most likely by the Americans, to put the Soviets in a very tough situation.
Well, Hafizullah Amin was a member of the same tribe. That's a very important aspect. And this was an issue where there's an old joke about the Ghilzais versus the Duranis. The Durrani was the royal family, and the Ghilzais had always longed to run Afghanistan. And they said every time the Ghilzai pushed the Durrani out, they said and got control of the country, they brought about disaster. And so this was another example where the Ghilzai were working towards, the Durrani had already been dispatched. That happened in 1978 when Muhammad Daoud was overthrown in a vicious, bloody coup, which
was actually unusual.
Very unusual.
Yeah,
Usually these were palace affairs. They walked up to the person in charge and they said, "We've decided that we don't want you running the country any longer. There's a plane waiting at the airport to take you to Italy or to France or someplace, okay, overseas." And so this was a bloody coup, and it was very unusual. But as this progressed, it became very clear that this was not your average rebellion against authority in Afghanistan. The Duranis had held Afghanistan together as a nation for a couple of hundred years, older than the United States. And so longer than the United States. It was very complex because of all the different ethnic groups within Afghanistan, very complicated.
I think there's an important piece of information that's necessary. It's about Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and how he ended up being the person he ended up being. Gulbuddin Hekmatyar actually was a radicalized student, in the early 1970s, and he ended up in a conflict, with the Daoud government, and apparently was charged with murdering another communist student at Kabul University, and ended up, having to leave Afghanistan. Actually, was in prison. He was in prison, right? Yeah. But then eventually, Daoud had an amnesty, and he ended up basically being taken in by Pakistan, and this would have been 1973. So what you're looking at is the original convergence, and that's where the U.S. ended up connecting to Hekmatyar and
through the Pakistani ISI,
right? And Masood too, Ahmad Shah Masood, right, who was the Tajik leader that was the Lion of the Panjshir. He was also one of these rebels that ended up in Pakistan. And so that became the kind of cornerstone of the American sort of access into Afghanistan's internal political process. So they did have these radicals within their own community that they obviously had their own ideas. And the US always is very good, I think. In fact, I don't think it's just the US. I think this is imperial thinking. You find the discontent, jerk, criminal, whatever, who you can radicalize more and pay a lot of money to, who's going to front for you. And Gulbuddin Hekmatyar fit the bill perfectly. And so when you take that original status that he got, and this would have started in 1973, that he became he became one of the people who was sent back into Afghanistan to destabilize Afghanistan. That was coming out of Pakistan from 1973. Right. So this is all part of.
He didn't do very well either.
Oh, well, that's the wonderful thing about Gulbuddin. He actually didn't do very well in dealing with the Soviets either. Apparently, he was much better at killing other mujahideen that were in competition for the money he was getting.
When we were in Afghanistan at one point, somebody told us, they said Gulbuddin Hekmatyar's talent was he had a guy on a motorcycle, and he outside the tribal areas, and he said every time they heard that something had happened, the guy on the motorcycle drove to Kabul or Peshawar rather, drove into Peshawar and found the American media people at the local bar and said, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar just had this thing done.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
Yeah.
He just set a bomb off in Kabul. Right. Okay. Right. And it was all, whenever the news came in, and that was it. It was all a PR campaign.
But this is the important key here, though, is when it connects back to Amin and what happened to Amin vis-a-vis the Soviets and the invasion of 1979 was that the Soviets had gotten wind of the fact that there was apparently a deal being developed between Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and Hafizullah Amin. And the Soviets knew what that meant. I mean, Amin already had a compromised reputation. He was already considered fundamentally a CIA asset, but combining with Gulbuddin meant that the Soviets knew that that was going to be a crisis on their southern border, all right? And so that had a lot to do, we believe, with the motivation that led to the assassination, the killing of Hafizullah Amin in December 27th, 1979.
That explains so much, because it's such a paradox that you had this nominally Marxist leader of Afghanistan who was killed by the Soviets upon the invasion.
I know. Yeah,
and
I know.
everybody just lives with this paradox without properly like fleshing it out. And you guys are able to bring that is the first time I've seen a sufficient reason provided for that paradox ever.
Same thing with Adolf Dobbs. I mean, we had the opportunity to sit down and spend some time with Selig Harrison, who was the only person. I mean, there wasn't very much going on. There weren't very many people telling the truth about what was going on in Afghanistan.
Who knew it? Never mind.
Even understood it, let alone tell the truth about it. But Selig Harrison had actually gone to Kabul the summer of 1978 when Adolf Dobbs was first assigned there. There wasn't much going on, and he said he had a long evening with him, and he said he laid out the whole plan of what he was trying to do. He knew it would be very difficult. He knew it wasn't going to be easy, and he knew Brzezinski was going to oppose it back in Washington. So what he was going to do is he met with Amin 15 times or 14 or 15 times in private. He didn't even tell the embassy, apparently.
In secret, actually.
Yeah, what he was up to, because he knew that the minute Brzezinski would hear about it, he'd put the kibosh on it. So this is what he was up against. And so, of course, Brzezinski wanted to use anything he possibly could to inflame the situation. They were supporting the insurgency. They were trying to get the government disrupted, overthrown. It turns out that they really weren't having a lot of effect in terms of the insurgency. But the Soviets were very concerned. The primary concern with the Soviets was that Amin was going to turn Afghanistan over to Pakistan and the Americans.
And that's where the Gulbuddin relationship really triggered.
And that's where Gulbuddin was the agent that was going to have. They were going to form a government. We did speak with somebody a few years back who was very close to both Amin and Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. And he said, yes, that was the plan. The plot was that the two of them were going to get together, and the word leaked out to the Russians that this was going to happen. It was going to happen on a certain date. And so they panicked in Moscow. Brezhnev panicked, his inner circle panicked. The rest of the country, the rest of the Politburo didn't want it. They were fully aware of it. They had sent the KGB in, a special unit in the year before. They had spent the whole year in Afghanistan, and they said, the one thing we don't want to do is invade. There's absolutely no way we can win this war. They knew it full well. And so they went against all of that. It was pretty much Brezhnev's desire to do.
They said it was because Taraki was
murdered
favorite
by Amin.
of Brezhnev. And when Taraki killed him,
He was killed by Amin.
By Amin. They believed that Brezhnev just dissolved.
He lost it.
And he was sick. He was
very ill.
Very ill.
In fact, even the
that was another paradox too. I couldn't quite understand how Brezhnev would go renegade against his own Politburo, but what you're saying there clarifies that a bit too.
There was a conference in Lissabon, Norway, in 1995, where a lot of the people who were working behind the scenes in the Politburo with the reports that were going to Brezhnev said that they were just ignoring all the reports. I mean, he was ignoring all the reports.
This is actually, I have the report right here that General Lyakovsky actually gave in terms of what the thinking was behind the move. And it said at the same time, alarming information started to arrive about Amin's secret activities. Okay, and he was, it goes on. I can forward this to you.
Please do.
All this has created, I can barely read it. On the one hand, the danger of losing the gains made by the April 1978 revolution. The scale of insurgent attacks will increase by spring within the country, while on the other hand, the threat to our position in Afghanistan, right now there is no guarantee that Amin, in order to protect his personal power, will not shift to the West. So that was the main concern, was that he was going to shift to the west. They were afraid that he was going to duplicate what had happened to them in Egypt
Well,
back in
especially because of the
1972.
loss of Iran. That was also part of it.
Right.
Because the US had lost Iran,
Right.
they were convinced that that was going to motivate them to want to turn Afghanistan into a replacement for Iran.
And there was talk of that.
Yeah,
there actually was talk
exactly,
of that
yeah.
in Washington, that they were going to move the listening
So,
posts.
you know, you
Yeah.
can see that there's sort of these internal immediate choices that were being made because of the actual facts on the ground that they were dealing with.
Now, what's so interesting about this whole phenomenon is that within the Washington community, all of this information just simply is not known.
Mhm.
It's never been conveyed to the appropriate people that are making the policy.
Mhm.
And it's just extraordinary when you realize, I mean, when our books came out 10 years ago, we would go around, we did a lot, big book tours all over the country. People would stand up and they would say, I consider myself to be very well read, but the stuff you're telling me right now is the first time I've ever heard it. So we did this event at Harvard, at the Cambridge Forum in Harvard in 2009. And we're standing there, and we had been told the day before that the person who was going to be moderating it was Charles Dunbar. Charles Dunbar had run the American embassy as a chargé when we were there in 1983 with Roger Fisher. And he was a career diplomat, and then he'd left Afghanistan and gone over to the other side and run the Mujahideen operation. I guess he knew what was going on in Kabul pretty well by then. So anyway, and then so I see him standing there. We walk in to the meeting, and I see him standing there with somebody I recognize as Charles Cogan, Chuck Cogan. Chuck Cogan was the guy who ran Operation Cyclone. He was the chief of the Directorate of Operations for the Near East South Asia for the CIA from 1979 to 1984. And he's standing there talking to Charlie Dunbar. So we walk in, and I said, Mr. Cogan, and he looks like James Coburn. I mean, that's what they referred to him as, you know, the actor, James Coburn. You know, Francophile, gray hair, mustache, perfectly coiffed mustache, erudite, about 6'2", you know. And so he says, you know who I am? And I said, we were in a documentary together. That's why I know who you are. So anyway, so needless to say, we do our question and answer after we give our presentation. The first man up to the microphone is, guess who? Charles Cogan. And he says, you know, I agree with what you said about the Soviets not wanting to go in. He said, I know, I've read the Politburo papers, I've read the conversations they had, and I agree that, you know, they were not pursuing the Persian Gulf. They didn't want to invade, didn't want to have to invade. He said, but I don't agree with this whole thing about Brzezinski, that he intentionally lured them into Afghanistan. He said, I just don't get that. He said, that's not the way the system works. I know, I ran the operation for 5 years and I never heard that at all.
Yeah, that was because Cogan assumed that anything like that would have had to have gone through his purview.
Right.
Nothing at that level could have gone by him that
So
way.
tell him what happened, Liz.
Well, anyway, we ended up in 2015 having the opportunity to ask Chuck Hogan if he would agree to an interview, which he did. And
Very graciously.
Very graciously. It was actually in his mid 80s at that point. And we start the interview, and to our delight and surprise, he almost immediately begins to talk about this amazing thing that happened.
Can I tell you a story about Brzezinski?
Yeah, he relays the fact that a few years back, he actually encountered Brzezinski at Samuel Huntington's memorial service. And he went up to him and he said, I never met him before. And I went up and I said, I think what you're doing is incredible. And I think what you're doing is absolutely correct. But I wanted to let you know that I never, ever accepted the idea that you intentionally lured the Soviets into Afghanistan. That interview clearly misrepresented you.
Lavelle Observatoire did an
the
interview.
1998 interview. And Brzezinski told him point blank, and he told us point blank on our video, he said, no, you're wrong. We did do it. You didn't know what we were doing in the White House. And it was literally, it was quite shocking to get Kogan, I mean, Chuck Kogan is actually a very, if you skip what the man actually does for a living, he's a very pleasant man. I mean, if you get my point, very, very pleasant,
Very refined guy.
very refined.
And he obviously had his set of rules, and he was very genteel about what he did, and he was the equivalent of a 3-star general
right. Well,
in
he
the
did.
army.
He did apparently whatever he did. He personally apparently didn't have to do the dirty work himself. That's what we assumed. But one thing we did get from him that was really quite amusing was his utter hatred of Charlie Wilson. He considered him to be sloth.
Oh,
He hated him.
He
so
said
much.
that Charlie Wilson didn't do that. He said that was just his publicity.
Well,
campaign.
the whole, the way that the whole campaign got wrapped up in Charlie Wilson's war.
Charlie Wilson got to be the hero.
One, and that's of course what they turned into the film that became
the myth makers.
The myth-making story that most Americans believe is the role the U.S. played in Afghanistan.
But I asked him, I said, why did you do it? Knowing what has happened since, with 9/11 and all that stuff, he says, we had to get back at the Russians for what they did to us in Vietnam. That was it.
And you know what? He could have cared less about the impact that decision had on the Afghan people.
And the millions of people it displaced, and however many millions were killed,
they had
that
to get
simply
back,
was not a factor.
Yeah. Well, when you read things like Brzezinski's grand chessboard, I mean, it's indicative that he thinks of the world like a chess game. There's no human beings with souls or anything like that. It's all abstract.
He had set out to do it years before. I mean, we spoke with someone who knew him when he was a professor when he was at Harvard.
Yeah.
And he said that he and Richard Pipes used to walk around Harvard Yard speaking in high Polish, so nobody could understand what they were plotting.
Yeah. But I think, though, I would have to say this, though, about people like that. I think that this condition, as we mentioned, our term for it is late stage imperial dementia, and I actually think it is an actual identifiable condition. And it isn't just people who are at the high end of this. You can get low-level tyrants that have this disease too. You can get some people think their mothers or mother superior or whoever has got the disease. You can tell when someone is so wrapped up in some kind of this powerful assumption that whatever they have to do is so important, and if you're in their way, they get to wipe you out.
I think it's called self-righteousness.
Yeah. They get to wipe you out, and it's real. And I don't think that, and that's, I think, part of the problem, trying to hold levels of people accountable for certain kinds of activities, because their mind at the time they did it is not the mind they come back to. And it's very difficult to reconcile. And it's not just, you can't just call it insanity in the sense of an individual case of one person doing something. This is a macro.
Absolutely. Yeah. Like there's that statement where you think you're playing the game, but the game starts playing you.
Yeah. And they are,
in the process.
And Brzezinski was absolutely brilliant at playing the game through Carter. That was an absolute brilliant. And the fact that he left government, he had done his job. He didn't need to be in there again. And the effect of Brzezinski's actions we're still living with the effect of Brzezinski's actions, because the neocon agenda that now is literally tied Washington in knots. I mean, the Russophobia is all part of it. It's as if he let loose a level of Russophobia that just, was far more toxic than had ever been let loose before.
Yeah. And that also struck me when we were reading your piece, and then we should probably say something about the resistance you met back home in America when you came back with the story. But I don't want to say that yet. I first want to just point out, based on what you just said, the fact that we're still living through the consequences of these decisions. And one of the things that was built up, as you pointed out, today we have this gigantic heroin problem in the world that is interconnected with the drug banks, things like BCCI, or even more recently HSBC, which was convicted and found guilty of drug money laundering and terrorist financing. And people, through just their wiring, how they've been conditioned to think, they are so myopic or compartmentalized that they have a very difficult time seeing the interconnectedness
Yeah.
of how this machine works
Right.
as a chemistry. And
Right.
what you've done by not just showcasing or talking about it in the present, but getting at how did this thing emerge? What are its origins? How did that is very, very valuable, really valuable. But going back to the question that I want to really ask on CBS, NBC, I know in both of your excursions to Afghanistan, you produced some incredible, groundbreaking footage, great reporting. I watched both of the presentations, so did Cynthia. The one in 1981 is obviously pretty unfiltered, I think. I mean, when I watched it, it really doesn't fit the narrative that Zbigniew was pushing about the big bad Soviets going into their own Vietnam. It's like you were able to really destroy that narrative quite well. But despite that, it was a fight to get that story taken up by CBS or NBC. And we were hoping maybe you could say a little something about what was the resistance all about? Why would they not want to hug you and embrace you as the only Americans going in with this story?
I know. I mean, that's what galls me today so much about this censorship issue and deplatforming and all these things that are going on. I mean, I had to struggle to make sure when I was in Afghanistan that I was not getting censored.
Yeah.
And because I mean, here they were. I mean, they point guns at you, and you walk through minefields, and they had this crazy censor who was basically
in Afghanistan.
It costs a lot of money back in 1981 and 82 and 83 to go there. You had to bring the camera rental alone was,
It was like $75,000 worth of equipment we had to take
we
with
had to
us.
drag in on the airplane
and all
with
of
us.
it, had
Lights,
to be,
record, tape recorders, cameras, all of it. And so, and then in addition to getting there and then getting back in one piece. So, it's like, I basically laid it out to the people I was dealing with at the Kabul government. I said, I know you guys are, responsible for doing some crazy things when it comes to foreign reporters, like kicking them out of the country or whatever. I said, don't censor my material. And whatever you do, if you censor it, you're not going to be happy with what I'm going to say. So don't do it. And I made it very clear to them. And with Roger Fisher, 1983, we sat there with the foreign minister, and I brought it up I had brought it up to the head of the press that I had to deal with at the foreign ministry. I said, look, you can't censor me in terms of what I'm doing. If I see a Russian tank in the street, I'm going to shoot it and I'm going to put it in the beast. And he goes, well, that's not my power to determine that. He said, that's the censor. I said, look, you got to work with me on this. Okay. I'm going to fight for you when I get back to the United States. I have to fight them. I'm not going to fight you over what I'm allowed to shoot. So anyway, so we're sitting there with the foreign minister, and so Roger brings it up. He said, and by the way, we want to be able to go and shoot anything we want to shoot. And the foreign minister says, is that a problem? And I said, yes, it's a problem. It's definitely a problem. The last guy that was here from Canada, I think he went in, and they took the sensor and went and blacked out. Anytime they saw a soldier walking down the street or a tank or an airplane flying overhead or something, black everywhere. And the first thing CBS News did was they reported it and they said, see, the Afghans have got everything to hide. They're hiding the Russians, the fact that the Russians are there. So I said, they're going to beat you to death with it if you do that to me. So I said, we're here to give the American people an honest look at what's going on. And I'll fight for you when I get there. I'll fight for the look that I got, but don't censor me. So anyway, we get to the censor the day before we're supposed to leave, and you can't leave the country unless he stamps your tapes. I've got 2 boxes of videotapes that we've just spent the last 10 days shooting. And the censor says, it's my job to censor your tapes. And I said, I got permission from the foreign minister to not censor my tapes. And he said, I don't work for the foreign minister. I'm the censor. If I think your tape needs to be censored, I'm censoring it. So I said, okay, we're leaving. I picked up the tapes.
No, that was after a full day.
I walked out.
actually
No, I
spent the whole
picked up the
thing,
date and tapes and walked out the door. Okay. This was in the morning. So anyway, I said, okay, guys, go out and shoot anything you can find. Planes, tanks, whatever, Russian soldiers bayoneting people, whatever you can find. I said, just get it. And I said, worst comes to worst, I'm going to take the tapes and throw them over the U.S. Embassy front gate. They'll love to get them.
Charles Cogan.
Chuck Cogan will love to get it.
Dunbar.
Charlie Dunbar will love to get it. So anyway, we go back at the end of the day, and our guide, who we've become kind of friendly with at this point, he's just kind of laughing off to the side. So I said, what's going on? And he says, Sayer Hushbang was the guy's name. He said, Mr. Hushbang, he said, they had to convene the Central Committee to make a decision on your edict that you laid down. And I actually yelled when I was there the first time, earlier that day. I said, you will not censor my tapes. Anyway, so he said, they took it seriously. They convened the Central Committee. He said, have you ever seen those funny movies where the guy's on the phone and he gets higher and higher and higher, and then sits back down again, and then he goes back up again and sits back down? He said, that's what was happening. He said, he didn't even have to listen to what he was saying. He said, you could see it in his face. So anyway, so he said, you won't, he said, he's going to stamp your tapes. He's not even going to look at them. You can get to leave, and you'll leave in the morning, and that everything will be fine. So that's what it was. So anyway, so we got out of Afghanistan with our tapes uncensored with the stamps on them. And
lo and behold, we ended up back.
We get to ABC
and discover that's where the real censoring.
So Roger's all, Roger had already been asked by the Russians, what is it going to take to get us out of Afghanistan? And here we were with the first, the minute he got there, I was there a week before. He arrives with Liz and the crew, and he just disappears. I said, where did Roger go? I said, nobody knows, nobody's seen him. So he comes back around dinner time, and he says, I was just over at the Soviet embassy. He said, they sent this guy down from Moscow to talk to me. He said, they sent their highest level guy for South Central Asia down to talk to me. And he said, Andropov did. So he said, they really don't want to be here. And they need to know, how can they get out? And he said, and that's what I'm doing. He says, I'm an expert in negotiation. So we've got this amazing story here. So we get back to New York, we do the whole thing. I do this piece for ABC Nightline. I narrate it with the footage that we shot. And then they put Roger on live with Vladimir Bukovsky,
a Soviet dissident working with British intelligence,
who basically says, oh no, this is just Soviet propaganda.
No, actually, but the thing that was so unbelievable was that he would literally say, no, the Soviets don't want to leave. And Ted Koppel, the host of the program, wouldn't ask him for any proof, any actual commentary. No, nothing. So he gets to simply state, no, they don't want to leave. And that became the argument that Roger had.
And he ends the show by saying, well, folks, there you have it. The Russians really don't want to go. And that was the end of the discussion. We tried to get PBS, we tried to get ABC, NBC,
they were
CBS, CNN, all of them. They said, no, we're not touching this one with a 10-foot pole.
That was
1983.
There was an actual story, though, and Columbia Journalism Review did a story about what happened when Dan Rather did his Gunga Dan routine, which was going through Pakistan.
The spring of 1980.
All right, about a year before we went, okay? And when he came back with that story, it was on 60 Minutes. And the analyst that got this story into Columbia Journalism Review noted the fact that the entire framing of the story went from somewhat complex to one note, Johnny. It was a one note story. It became the Mujahideen, the freedom fighters, and the evil empire. And it was very interesting to see that at that point, even though they had already completely neutralized any complexity on the networks, they were at least still getting some little complexity from Columbia Journalism Review. But, so you could see the way the process worked. And so ironically, we ended up with our original story with Dan Rather and CBS News. And we know in our experience that they really did not want what we had. And I think that, we did actually get the best out of them because, thank goodness we were able to get something out of them, I guess. But, the idea that, but what we really understood, and I think it was really embodied in, I think the most amazing experience we had was really it would have been the end of 1981 when we did the documentary for PBS. We did an airing of it at a function that was basically a preview before it was going to be distributed on PBS. And we had a lot of media people at this event, and it was in Boston at the time. And one of the people that attended this function was Theodore Eliot, who at the time was the dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. And he also happened to have been the ambassador to Afghanistan preceding Dubs. He was there from 73 to 78. And, you know, what we encountered that evening was the kind of total embodiment of, you know, sort of coming up against sort of the narrative creation process in its most powerful form. This man stood up in the middle of the event and basically called Paul a conduit for Soviet propaganda, effectively, for showing what he saw, okay, in Afghanistan, and then challenged him about it. Fortunately, Paul was up to the task of turning it around on him, and ultimately the audience that basically, you know, supported Paul's position that freedom of the press was more important, you know, than complying with the narrative that he felt it should have been. An eyewitness account is clearly, you know, he hadn't been there actually since 1978. This was an account from 1981. So Paul did trump him at that point, but it was just so unbelievable to see. And Theodore Eliot would have been one of the very high level people in this architecture of narrative creation, not only as, you know, an ambassador, but he's also a high-level Brahmin. He was, you know, long-standing
Boston Brahmin. Ancestors at the Salem witch trial.
You know, so you've got this whole architecture of what the State Department really represents. You know, they claim that people who, at least they used to claim that people who worked for the State Department actually had to be able to go back at least 7 generations in order to be approved, you know, just to even enter.
For anybody listening on YouTube or BitChute, Boston Brahmin is a reference to the Brahmin, the caste system in India. So for people who are a little bit more aware and savvy of how actual power structures in North America work, thinking that we're just a pure democracy, no. There is actually a real power structure with its own internal sort of logic, and it is a caste system. And so a lot of these old families embedded in New England got that name in the 19th century.
Growing up here in Boston, you were basically judged by how many generations you were from the first person that stepped off the Mayflower.
Yeah, it's these wannabe hereditary oligarchs.
Absolutely, yeah. But the idea that this, sorry.
Yes. Oh no, go ahead, finish.
No, I was just a finishing comment about, living in the Boston area. You get very used to this high-minded concept of the sort of the Brahmins that really run this
shining
place.
City on a hill.
There was, a lot of, but I think what is also important to remember is that the State Department actually is a front for the CIA. And I think once you really understand that that's what it is, you understand what diplomacy is all about.
CIA is just diplomacy by other means. But it's,
And speaking of other fronts for the CIA, you said something that was really disturbing for me. I mean, it's not a shock about the whole Dan Rather, Gadunga Dan, or however you say it, reporting in Afghanistan, and the fight that you had to wage against that narrative, which was the one that they wanted to dominate. But you also mentioned that Dan Rather was connected to being one of the few that were chosen to report on the JFK assassination narrative.
Cruder film.
Yeah, and also the person who ended up interviewing you one-on-one, that was kind of grilling you, and they only took like a snippet of your interview. He was attached to Dan Rather.
Right.
So you can see like this orchestration of how it's all tied into something so much more sinister in the background.
Yeah, well,
exactly. I mean, Bob Schieffer and Dan Rather are 2 Texas guys, South Texas guys. And in fact, Bob Schieffer actually wound up driving Lee Harvey Oswald's mother to the police station the day of the day of the,
I forgot about that.
Yeah, really. I mean, we did a story for CNN in South Texas and in South America about some of these people. And, South Texas is kind of like feudal England. You're going back to the 12th century when you're dealing with
Genteel
South Texas.
aristocracy.
Oh, feudal warlords.
Oh yeah,
Like,
feudal
they're
warlords. I mean,
warlords, yeah.
you own a ranch that's, as big as the size of Rhode Island, the state of Rhode Island, and and you appoint the judges and the police force,
Yeah,
and if there's somebody you don't like,
they're gone.
they're
Yeah.
gone. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think the important thing I would say about what we've come to realize about these relationships, and I think I mentioned a little bit of it earlier, is that I mean, what you have with Team A and Team B, or with the Democrats or the Republicans, whatever your perception is about their fighting with each other, you really have to understand that deep down they are connected. They are really not on a different team. They are on one team. All right. And that is part of the gaming of the public. So once you kind of let go of that idea, I mean, that's what we really learned about good guys like Senator Fulbright, who wrote this amazing article in 1972 about the manipulation of the neocon thinking on the good guys like him,
Right.
okay, that allowed this horrible Vietnam War to develop the way it did, okay? And then you begin to realize, and that's really what we witnessed in 1979, when the entire progressive construct collapsed into a giddy high practically, okay? And the best of them said, it's over, okay? The New Deal, FDR, all the guys from that era were finally gone. They had, and what you realize is that they had given over. They stopped fighting. Their cause was gone. And then you begin to say, maybe their cause wasn't what we thought it was. Maybe the reason that they couldn't stand up to it was because they never were that separate from it. That they were always going to come over at some point. And that's part of the, sort of this maturation of what we're really dealing here with. We are the people and they are on the other side. And you've got to just connect. People are people and they're different. And that's part of the imperial thinking. And that's part of the, like this insanity that can take over and produce what we jokingly referred to as, imperial dementia.
Yeah.
Theodore Eliot, by the way, at the time was also the head of the American branch of the Bilderberg organization,
Yeah.
which nobody had any idea
At the
about
time.
At the time,
Yeah, that was in 1981 when it came to
1981.
our
Said,
event.
what's a Bilderberger?
So we've always known that. We've probably been on some strange list ever since then.
Ever since that moment.
Just the very fact that somebody that high level would have been placed, as you pointed out in the book, in such a low level, low priority country as on a diplomatic mission was already bizarre. There was definitely something else being planned in that zone.
Exactly.
Absolutely. For years, he was there from
There.
73 to 78.
Yeah.
So that was a long haul. Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's so many more things to talk about. I'm just looking at the time, and I'm wishing that maybe we could even do a follow-up at some point, because I feel like despite the fact that we've covered all of these incredible topics, there's still so much more that we could just sit down and talk. But all that to say, anybody watching this or listening to this on their iPods should really be inspired at this point to buy the book. You have to, just scratching the surface, you got to buy the book.
Well, we hope so. We hope so. That's for sure.
Well, I mean, we told it this way. We did it this way because, we wanted to convey our experience the way we experienced it.
Yes.
And, so we needed to take some things and we needed to, expand on them in a way that would give you the feeling for what it was like for Al Lowenstein, as an example, to kind of go, let me tell you something. I want to tell you something. We got the goods on the people that killed JFK and Bobby Kennedy, and we just need Ted to be the president so that we can, but the only way these people will come forward is if he's president so they can be protected. And then 2 weeks later, he's killed. So it's like, oh, okay. So
it was beyond
we've
bizarre.
had these kind of, like an arrow just flew by, and hit the wall. I said, "Ooh, where did that come from?"
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
That's what the experience was like, but it didn't all happen at once. It didn't happen in a 90-minute movie. It happened over a number of years.
I think that was the thing about being able to process over the decades a kind of constant, I think the way that humans, at least the way I feel, I mean, every sense has a different story. So it takes time for all your senses to come together.
Mm-hmm.
And that is what takes, in fact, that's what took us decades. I mean, we've come to revelations about what we originally thought in the last 2 years that are shocking to us,
I mean, even now, it's like all of a sudden you reread something and say, wait a minute, that's connected to that.
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
Oh,
I never
right,
made that
understand,
simple
you know?
connection. It was always there.
Yeah.
It was always in my
Right
face,
in
but I
front of
didn't
you.
see it.
Well, I think
We felt
oh.
that way very much, by the way, reading your book.
Yeah,
Really?
absolutely. Because you feel a certain sense of maybe confidence, thinking that okay, here I've done a lot of work on these various subjects. I've made a set of personal discoveries that I think have value. They're useful. But then all of a sudden, another experience comes up that you could not have anticipated, like what we got out of reading your book, and your associated articles on the Trotskyite origins or aspects of Burnham and the neocons. That was all. That's been all revolutionary, but then it just has you change all of your mental relationships and values of all of the things you were taking for granted and how they're associated with each other, right? So, and that's, I think, what a natural, healthy human mind does when it is in a state of humility, when it's seeking truth. We're constantly referring back to our own experiences. We've got that self-reflective mode. And so few people, I find, have tapped into that part of themselves, that natural part of themselves, which is why they tend to so easily fall into these patterns of behavior of herd mentality that just have them walking into a slaughterhouse without even realizing that, whoa, wait a minute.
Exactly.
We've done this before.
Right.
We should be able to see where this is going.
I'm afraid, I think, truthfully, I think the entire educational system is set up to do just what you said.
Yeah.
And I think that, I mean, I jokingly have said the higher up the food chain you go in the educational system, you know,
We were in the Soviet
the
Union.
dumber you get. And at some level,
We
you
were,
know,
we were in the Soviet Union in 1977, 70, I think it was 77, 78.
Yeah.
And no, 87, in 1987. And we went with a group of Hollywood people who wanted to see if they could do co-productions with the Moscow studio. So anyway, you know, I mean, kind of LA and Boston are very different anyway. I mean, you know, we're much, I'd say we could, you know, first winter you get here, you know, you kind of feel about what it's really like to be a New Englander. And when you live from November until March. But these Hollywood types were just kind of like, they were like floating on air. And that we could see that after a few days, they were like, they had been so cocooned their entire lives by this Hollywood thing, in addition to the American thing, that they just didn't simply, they were looking around at the experiences that they were having, and they couldn't quite understand it. They really were saying, you know, wait a minute, you know, I don't understand. There were people at one point, we were in Leningrad, and we were introduced to some of the survivors of the siege of Leningrad. And they were children during the siege, and their hands were permanently disfigured by the rickets and the diseases that they got because of the malnutrition. And the people from LA were like, huh? What do you mean? What, you couldn't eat? What do you mean you couldn't eat? You know,
Marie Antoinette.
It was like, I never thought there were Americans like that, but that's how distanced they were. I don't think they'd say that now, personally, not with the way LA is these days in San Francisco, but certainly.
I think also, you know, this theme that you've been coming back upon too, that like there aren't different sides. Sorry if there's background noise behind me. There's I think a street cleaner. That's one of the things I think that's driving people a bit insane today, as I think the pressure cooker is kind of like reaching a maximum point. But a lot of people who are starting to realize that maybe there aren't the best intentions for the future of humankind, let alone even, you know, the Western sphere. There's so many things to create division and camps. And it's like, this is my obsessive theme, or this is my obsessive theme. And it's played out so that people are increasingly divided. And that's the old game, the imperial game of divide and conquer. But now it's increasingly the mental domain. But as you go further into things which do look insane, and they are insane on some level, but at the same time, the insanity is also a bit of a veneer as a distraction, so that you cannot connect different camps that are actually all playing on the same team. They're actually, as you said about James Burnham, right? Like James Burnham wasn't really ever what he said he was. And you can get, I mean, a lot of Trotskyists are very confused about Burnham, right? But you know, you can't take things as at face value. And I think that is really where the game is at, that there is so many of this insanity is all coming to a central theme. And then importantly, that we do have some good, I think, veins of thought that are in opposition to this, but unfortunately, that voice has gotten a lot quieter.
Well, I think in the confusion that's happening right now, I think you know, at this point for a lot of people, it's just stopping. It's just listening. It's just not doing anything. I don't think people have to really do much at this point except try to calm down and listen and try to, you know, get a sense. Don't try to figure it out, you know, and that the hysteria is part of what is being tripped now. A lot of the fear programming is clearly plugging into that, and that's why the fear programming is there. You know, this is pretty well documented.
And fear shuts down thinking. As you know, Aldous Huxley was a very good friend of William Sargent for a reason, who's the British psychiatrist that undoubtedly did work at the Tavistock Institute. But the more you fear, you cause increased fear and stress, the lower the level of critical thinking and the higher your suggestibility. And so with everybody freaking out, instead of just keeping calm, as you're saying, and having a dialogue, and like, you know, we can't control everything that happens to us. Sometimes you might, you know, you might get the short end of the stick, but we have to be courageous in whatever we find ourselves in, and calm enough to you know, have I think we need to come back together, I think, in our dialogue. That was so messily said, I'm sorry.
No, not at all.
Oh,
no. I mean, but I think that we're totally in agreement that but I think when people first encounter the shock, that I mean, there's a term called shakabuku. I don't know if, I mean, I know it's one of those urban myth words, you know, they claim that what that is it's a spiritual
kick in the head.
All right. It's whatever does it to you. Okay. And I think that people are really going through that in ways that they're shocked at the way it's happening, not just the shock alone of it happening, you know, and that process of coming out of that to come to some kind of at least awareness, and just, you know, but you know, the difficulty of having to have an answer to something that you have no concept of yet. And I think for a lot of people, I mean, that's what we've encountered actually about Afghanistan. You know, we go back to you know, to when in 9/11, before 9/11, when people didn't understand why we thought Afghanistan was so important. And then 9/11 hit, and we were deluged with all this demand for instant information. And then what we really noticed that was actually a very important experience was how that faded into nothing. Okay, and we went, you know, so we kept going through these levels of nothingness, it seemed like. But that's what I think you really learn, that it isn't nothing. It just isn't visible yet. And I think that's what you have to trust, that there is an actual building process. And the more stable you can be in your process, the more you help build that stability, I think, in what you deliver.
Yeah, I think the biggest part, I do believe that the most important aspect of communication is of a nonverbal type. You know, two people could say the same things, but only one of them has a certain power to teach what they're saying, whereas the other person, it falls on deaf ears. And sometimes it's just, is it coming from a place of love, the message, right? And if it is, the humanity has something I've noticed, regardless of what culture you're from or what time frame you're living in, a certain resonance on that deeper spiritual, maybe subconscious sometimes level.
Well, we can see that in the stuff you're doing. It's you guys are doing wonderful things. You're the depth of your research, and
Oh my God, I mean, I'm overwhelmed with the level of
how do you keep
I don't know
up
how
with
you
it?
keep how you keep putting out so much stuff
And
all
it's
the
so
time.
good. It's all really good
We
stuff.
take years to put out so much
Hey,
stuff.
you guys can't turn the table on us. We're here to compliment you. You can't do that.
No,
I'm joking.
no.
Keep it coming.
Well, look,
You turned it around with a, you know.
well, it's great
with
to
a
be
depth
able to
and a
it's great
speed,
to be
yeah.
able to talk with two people who really understand the the kind of work that goes into this, and how you have to look at it, and
Well,
getting through this thing. I mean, the three Nights of Desmond actually came as a result of working with Oliver Stone. On
that was actually what we did for
Talk
him
about
originally.
putting-
That was the original script.
putting a gun to our head.
All
I
right,
mean,
you have to say something. We were gonna wrap up
Yeah.
the interview, but that's too big. All right, you have to
Yeah,
say
you can't say Oliver Stone and then leave it.
yeah. Go on.
But we could do a whole talk on just that experience alone. And believe me,
It all
we have things to tell you you wouldn't believe.
it all started when he said, if you can write it in a month, I'll think about optioning it. That was it. If you can write your story in a month.
4 weeks, basically.
4 weeks.
Yeah.
So it was a call on a Friday afternoon. I said, Liz, she was out shopping. She walked in the door. I said, we just got a call. I said,
We had
clear
given
the
him
decks.
we had given him a treatment,
Yeah.
and he said, if you can turn this into
a
a
screenplay.
screenplay in 4 weeks, I will consider optioning it. Okay. And
So that began our,
we realized that, knowing what we knew about him, that if we didn't get it to him literally in 4 weeks, no, what we knew is if we got it to him in 4 weeks, he'd have to option it. That's what we actually figured out. And he did.
he did.
And he
this-
regretted it.
He regretted
When
it.
did this happen? What period are we talking here?
Oh, this is 1992.
Yeah, 1992.
Right when JFK had just come out.
Oh yeah, we actually went to him in the first place because we had seen JFK, and we were already working on the Fitzgerald history, because we were already focused because of an amazing dream that our daughter had that kind of led Paul to believe that he needed to do this research on his family going back to the Norman invasion of Ireland. And so that's all part of what's going to be revealed in book 2. It's all
Interesting.
part of what's coming.
Very
Yeah.
mysterious.
Yeah, you're leaving quite the cliffhanger here. I guess, is there anything with the Oliver Stone? I mean, this relationship, I know he's reviewed your work, and will this be manifest in the form of some motion picture or documentary?
Well, we have no we have no concern. I mean, Oliver actually gave us something way beyond a film. He actually initiated us into the power of the dream itself. When we first connected with
Hollywood
him,
is a dream factory.
it is. And when we first connected with him, I personally, the minute we set up the first meeting, I began having intense dreams with him, that I knew him, that he knew me, he knew my family. I was, it was unbelievable. And then Paul, when we actually met with him, then the dream started for him. And that went on we had a working relationship with him for 3 years through the contract. We still connect to him, although not as regularly. I mean, we just, got an email from him last week, but there's a lot more distance. It's not as intimate as it was back then when we were actually meeting.
And he's
with
really
him.
not making movies anymore. He's
He's
making
doing
documentaries now.
Right.
But we feel that
And some very good
that's
ones.
that's what he actually gave us, was a reality of the actual power of the dream. And you have to understand, we're not New Agers. We were not at all coming from this kind of, la idea. It was real. and it gave us an actual understanding of the nature. And when you understand what imperialism is, it is actually the power of the imaginal realm, which is what the dream is a product of. So you begin to understand what this is, what mystical imperialism is.
The Mystical Communications Network was actually mentioned in an official U.S. government document about communicating with the Mujahideen. It said
1980.
this is it was the Senate Select Committee on Narcotics, and they were asking the people who are running the Mujahideen to please use their mystical communication network to convey the message that they were biting the hand that fed them.
Yeah. But the idea, I mean, that's one of the reasons why when you hear about this concept of separation of church and state, and you realize that's part of the illusion for the public. That's not real at all. In fact, imperial power is mystical power. If you don't have imperial power if you don't have mystical power. Okay. So and the dream is a practical manifestation at a personal level that you can relate to of what mystical power is. And the power of creation itself is wrapped up in this very real power. And that is exactly what he gave us a reality on. I mean, we didn't know that was going to happen, but
well, yeah, I think that you have, if your heart and mind are in a very good place, or in an honest place, tied to something bigger than yourself and truthful, then you will be able to channel your dreams and feed off of your dreams in a creative and positive way. And if you're not in that place, but you're still trying to utilize power, you're going to tend to create a nightmare. And that nightmare is going to be something which people all are induced to live in. But we have to make better dreams for people, I think, which is the power of art, really, right?
Well, but that I think is what
you have to project your wishes into your dream.
Right now, what we're suffering with is a revenge and retribution cycle that has been going on so long that what you have are generational situations that have no personal connection to the original sin that caused this, but are carrying it forward over and over and over again. And that's what we can stop. We have to stop that. And that's actually what we hope will happen with the book 2, because that's our goal with book 2, is to end the revenge and retribution cycle itself.
So I guess to bring it back as a final thought, a final parting thought for people, here we are 40 years after your experience on the ground in Afghanistan in this incredible life-changing drama. What do you hope that publishing these books now at this time, 40 years separated from those events, is going to, what do you see as the value for humanity right now in being able to tell your story in the way you're doing it at this moment of, also, it's another period of major change, right? We have a system which has sort of run itself to the edge of a boundary condition, and we're in a point of a lot of potential for good and for bad on both sides. So obviously,
well, we have 2 kids. We have 3 grandchildren. We want to have a future for them, the best possible future they can have. We know full well that there were so many things that were done in the past that we were fooled about, that, we were all fooled about. Our parents were fooled about. Their parents were fooled about.
But that's what keeps the revenge and retribution cycle going.
We're at the point where I think it's going to be pretty hard to fool us, our generation, and we're a little older than you guys, probably another generation older than you. But the fact is that, we were like you when we were your age. And
I mean, we met in 1970, and that was the Vietnam War. And I think at the beginning of this conversation, when I was giving you that original story, we really believed we had changed the world. You know what we've learned since we thought we changed the world? That we were being manipulated by a CIA operation that owned the entire anti-war movement. I'm not saying it wasn't real. Don't get me wrong. We know we had a real experience, but we also know it was co-opted. It was stolen from us, okay? And that's what we are demanding back. That's what we know we have a right to. And that's what we're trying to put in the in this story right now is how to take it back, is to actually do what they really want done for themselves.
Yeah.
They think their metaphors about finding the grail and finding this and that. It's like, everybody wants that, but what is it? Well, we've actually applied that to our personal lives. And I think that's my point to you about, we ended up on this kind of journey, okay, that kept pulling us back to Afghanistan over and over and over again. And it ended up becoming kind of personal. We had an amazingly lengthy experience with a wonderful Afghan called Sima Wali, who was was the embodiment of Afghanistan and the voice for Afghanistan. We ended up meeting a lot of individual people along the way, but it was really being pulled back. Our own daughter ended up being pulled into our story many times.
Strangely enough, yeah.
Very strange. I mean, she ended up at one point on a trip to Spain. It would have been like 2016 or something like that. And she was traveling with people, and she went off on her own one afternoon, and she just took a spontaneous trip on a boat, and she went someplace and met some people, and they invited her to a gathering, which she went to, and she gets to the gathering, and she's introduced to someone who's an Afghan. And he mentions he's an Afghan, and something about.
She said, my parents just wrote a book.
So
what's the name of it? She said, Invisible History. She says, I'm reading it right now.
Well, my aunt wrote the introduction. It was Seema's nephew that she met on this island.
Wow.
Taking a taxi cab in San Francisco.
It's like
she looks
It's
down.
just coincident. Now I'm joking.
Yeah,
That's great.
but wait, no. This is the last one. We promise, okay? In 2011, okay, Alyssa comes home for a Christmas holiday, and the day of our annual party, she says, I have a friend coming with her father. Oh, wonderful. What's their name? Larkin. I said, oh, Larkin? Her father's name is Peter Larkin. I went, wow, that's weird. The only Peter Larkin I ever knew was the guy that hired us at CBS News to go to Afghanistan. And she said he worked for CBS News. It was Peter Larkin. 30 years later, after meeting him,
7 o'clock.
he walks in.
I walk in the door. I see the door open, and there he is, Peter Larkin.
That's only one. That's one of a
CBS
number
News foreign editor.
Coincidences that Alyssa ended up directly connected.
How this happened? Mystical imperialism.
Yeah. Well, there you go. Exactly. So that's what we're trying to say about that. We've been invested with this experience, and there was something about going back to Afghanistan over and over and over again. And the most powerful thing was actually the dream that Alyssa had, that brought Paul to desire to go and do the investigation into the Norman invasion of Ireland, which actually, is part of book 2. I mean, I
love cliffhangers. I love cliffhangers.
Fitzgeralds have a long extended history with the British Empire.
And if you read, for people who are going to read volume 1, they're going to get teasers floating through that story, and I think those will create a nice springboard into volume 2. So we're looking forward to that.
Yeah. Well, that's what we're definitely moving along with that.
And I want to thank you very much for all your work and for having us on your show, and good luck with your work too.
Yeah.
Thank you guys. It's a pleasure, and we'll do this again sooner than later, I hope.
Okay.
Great.
Anytime.
Bye.
Cynthia, Matt.